Hi, I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland reads for you guys. I'm in actually a new setup, so if anything sounds particularly different, anything, different background noise or whatever else, hopefully that's not too distracting. Um, but I have actually moved, and so that's probably part of why. And my setup at my desk is a little bit different. Also, microphone's a little bit differently placed. So anyway, all of that is just to say that things are a little bit different now. So if things sound different, that's probably why. And today I want to talk about Ryszard Kapuściński. I hope I'm saying that sort of close to correctly. Travels with Herodotus. Kapuściński was a Polish journalist who, if I remember correctly from the little blurb at the back, he was born in Warsaw in 1932 and spent most of his young life around there. And as you can imagine, growing up in Warsaw in the 30s and 40s gives him a really unique perspective on the world. He's got a couple of stories in this book in particular about growing up. He tells a story about going door to door in Warsaw in like 1941 or 1942, right after Poland has been occupied um, by the Nazis, and trying to sell things door to door to get enough money to buy shoes for the winter. Um, and it's pretty heartbreaking, brutal stuff. He also tells some interesting stories about going to college in Warsaw in the 50s. Um, that I think he says he started in 1951, so that would be 19, right? Would make sense. And that the library had been destroyed during the war, and so he describes how all of his fellow students that they took notes during classes and that the lecturers knew their stuff but that they just didn't have like textbooks and things like that, so they basically just had to attend lectures and take good notes in order to learn things because they didn't really have a lot of these other resources. So really interesting stuff there by itself. But Kapuściński is also really interesting because he worked as a journalist for basically his whole professional life, for various Polish news outlets. For a good chunk of this book is about his experiences very early in his career working for what is basically a kind of student newspaper sort of thing. It's oriented towards young people and is very kind of at the sort of the cutting edge essentially of Polish post-war journalism from kind of the next generation that's grown up after the war. Um, and so he ends up being chosen to be a foreign correspondent. And he spent much of his career as a foreign correspondent all over the world. And a number of his books involve stories of times that he is in all of these different places. He covers a whole number of kind of like third world revolutions and all of this different kind of elements of political chaos, but also of just like what regular life is like in all of these different places, and also brings what is, at least for me as an American, a Westerner, a really interesting perspective of being in these various places where, for instance, various proletariat revolutions, as they are self-described, are taking place, and not immediately taking a negative view of all the things that are happening. He's not necessarily, I would say, like a huge believer in communism or anything like that. He has plenty to say about the bad things of what life is like in Poland behind the Iron Curtain. But he is also interested in just a kind of a different perspective on a lot of that sort of stuff that I think adds an interesting flavor and is also something that is not, I suspect, is not enough to ruin anyone's enjoyment of it, because he is, in addition to that, a really clever and thorough student of the material that he is exposed to, that he is much more interested in presenting the reality of what these experiences are like around the world than in pursuing a particularly kind of ideological narrative. And lived through some just kind of incredible, insane experiences. There's a story that is not in this particular book. I think it's in Shadow of the Sun, where he talks about being in West Africa during a period of political upheaval. I think he's in Nigeria, but I don't remember for certain. And if I remember, part of the idea is that there's also a fair bit of chaos in terms of political lines and essentially civil war happening in this particular part of West Africa. And he describes how he is driving along the highway to head towards whichever city he's going to, and is stopped by what is essentially an armed militia, a, um, a non-governmental military force taking part in the Civil War, and they, have a roadblock set up and all sorts of guns. They make him get out and give them all of the money in his wallet, and then they pour gasoline on him and are getting ready to light up. And one of them tells a joke, and they all start laughing, and that's apparently enough to diffuse the situation. And so they let him get back in his car, still dripping, literally dripping with gasoline, to go keep driving on, which is pretty fascinating story. Certainly much cooler in that situation than I would probably be, at least as, I mean, he describes himself being seriously messed up, but then he stays in all of these very, very chaotic parts of the world for a number of years after that. So he doesn't. Anyway, pretty remarkable stuff. Travels with Herodotus has some stories like that, but a lot of it is about his work as a young reporter, and also about his relationship with Herodotus, because he describes that when he was in college, there was a Polish translation of Herodotus that was finished and brought basically to the point of being ready to publish, except for censorial oversight. And the censors never let it go to press until after he had graduated, partly because this was very near the end of Joseph Stalin's lifetime. And he describes the sort of liberalizing thaw, as I think is the way that he puts it, after Stalin has died, and there's sort of more willingness to share all of these different things, because of course one of the things that he really gets at is that in the midst of this kind of totalitarian crackdown, a lot of communication becomes suspect for its multiple meanings, all of the ways in which a story, because Herodotus' histories is very much a story about this particular historical period, but especially right at pretty much the center of the story are this series of Persian emperors who conquered the largest at the time, known, at least as known to Herodotus, the largest land empire that anyone has ever been aware of, and then eventually set their sights on Greece for a whole number of reasons. And you can imagine why this kind of particular flavor of historical writing that is so interested in the character of these different individuals might be seen as commenting on much more contemporary history. Anyway, but after Kapuściński has graduated and Herodotus, this Polish translation, has been published, he is given a copy of this book before he first leaves Poland, and he is sent first to India, and he spends several weeks, maybe a little longer. It's unclear. I don't remember exactly how long it is, but it's a fair bit of time traveling around India. And he has his Herodotus with him, and this is his first experience outside of Poland. He stops in Italy for a little while before that, as part of his traveling. Essentially, that's apparently the cheaper way to travel. And then he ends up going to Maoist China, and then ends up in sort of the main part of his travels. And a lot of that is in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, all of these kind of post-colonial states that Kapuściński is traveling around and finding out about the history and the culture and all that sort of stuff. And then alongside that is talking about his particular experience of reading Herodotus. And there are large sections of this book where Kapuściński will, I'm sure that in Polish, he just quotes the Polish translation of Herodotus. In the English translation, it is from the Robin Waterfield translation of Herodotus, if I remember correctly. These sections of text from the original in translation, alongside Kapczynski's commentary. And Herodotus, if you have never read it, is fascinating for being sort of a blend of this kind of whole tapestry of anthropological research at one end, and then at the other end, much more of kind of a traditional narrative history that we would look at and recognize much more quickly. Especially as Herodotus in the second half, as he gets into the Great War, the invasion of Greece by the Persian Empire under Xerxes. And so this is a lot of what Kapczynski talks about is about being in all these different places, reading Herodotus after he is familiar, continuing to go back to this and be fascinated by the character of the author himself as he comes across in the text, and what we kind of must be able to figure out based on the nature of the ancient world and of this text, of what Herodotus must have gone through to travel to all of these places, and all of these kind of, this immense survey of the ancient world that is present in this book. And alongside all of the kind of storytelling is one of the big things that he gets into, this idea that Herodotus describes having heard all of these stories, and many of them are things that we in the present would probably immediately dismiss out of hand. All of these details about peoples further afield than the Greeks, who have kind of, strange practices attributed to them, or strange details. Some of them are remarkably accurate, we know, from corroborating evidence, but a lot of it is just these kind of myths and stories. And Herodotus is remarkably willing to share these stories in comparison to kind of a much more modern history that would pretty quickly eliminate all of those things from the historical record, probably, or perhaps present them much more clearly as things that are cultural artifacts of the culture where those stories are told, rather than a sort of part of this kind of colossal tapestry of anthropological research that Herodotus has done. Anyway, Kapczynski is a really fun writer to read, I find. I think he has a really in the best traditions of essentially kind of memoir style nonfiction, is great at sharing all of these fascinating and evocative stories from his travels, and also of getting into the kind of the culture and the unique memorable elements of all these different places, and of his own experiences. There's a sequence where he describes reading Herodotus, I think he's in West Africa again, although I don't remember. And he's on an island that is most famous as being essentially a gathering point for slavers in West Africa to gather up these immense numbers of slaves on this particular island because there's no way to get away because the waters are full of sharks and stuff from all of the the sharks are attracted by the bodies that are just dumped into the ocean because slaves end up living in horrific conditions and dying, and so that's how they get rid of them. And that he describes being in this place and he's reading Herodotus, and it's in the evening, and so his minimal light from the lantern is attracting all of these bugs, and then the local man who is sort of running the hotel that he's living at comes and puts together a sort of mix of herbs and berries and things to throw onto the fire to create a particular fume that will drive away all of the bugs. And he's kind of in this weird sort of twilight zone as he is reading about events thousands of years before his own life, and sort of fascinated by the reality of all of these figures in Herodotus compared to the sort of ephemeral nature of modern experiences and things. And it's really a really wonderful sequence to read, and as you might imagine, really certainly easy for me to get into as someone who is interested in all of this ancient history, and can certainly empathize with the idea of reading Herodotus and being fascinated and totally taken in by the character of this particular book. But yeah, Kapuściński, I've read a couple of his books by now. Shadow of the Sun is, I think, one that I mentioned, and The Soccer War, I think I read. I don't think I've read Imperium, and he's got a couple others. This one, I think, looking at the listed information, it was published kind of late in his career and translated. He died in 2007, I think is what it said. So, kind of a look back at the start of his career, but a really, really interesting kind of combined sort of travelogue and literary exegesis of this particular book, and sort of comparing his own experiences as a traveler interested in all of this anthropological and historical research with Herodotus as he appears in the text. And anyway, just a really fun and interesting thing to read if you're interested in travelogues in particular, and kind of finding out about these particular experiences of this one talented Polish journalist, basically. Anyway, and so yeah, I like this book a lot. I've enjoyed all the Kapuściński I've read, and I can thoroughly recommend this one if you are interested in something that I suspect is at least a little different than what most people are picking up to read most of the time. There's only, I don't remember, Goodreads says 8,801 ratings. So I don't know how that compares with anything else, but that's a little statistic to cap off our discussion of Ryszard Kapuściński's Travels with Herodotus. Anyway, so that's all for today. I'm hoping to do a couple more of these based on things that I've read recently. Read some really good books, and I really enjoy sharing this sort of thing with you guys. If you're not interested in books and are here basically just for RPG content, that's fine too. I don't know how much more of that there's going to be anytime soon, although I have been kind of thinking a little bit about that. But anyway, go read Travels with Herodotus if it sounds interesting to you. The particular, it's published by, the version that I read is published by Vintage. So anyway, pretty good book. Lots of fun to talk about. Read Herodotus also, of course, if you haven't. And yeah, that's going to be it for me. So I have been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.